As you guys know, we're doing these like sessions to try to capture some stories from the deeper past all the way until now. Part of the reason is that in the city right now there's a lot of movement and energy that's going towards and will continue to go towards projects that take a lot of inspiration from Cooper Square. And thinking about that, we thought it would be a really great idea to capture more of the lived stories, like the people's histories that made these projects actually be able to be a success. And by capturing those stories, try to pull out some of the lessons that can really contribute and be useful to these new movements that are evolving. And Ryan is here, an organizer from Picture the Homeless, the key group that's working on the land trust in East Harlem. And so this is like a real moving thing, right? And so I wanted to thank you all for coming and contributing, because I know some of you have been here for decades contributing.
I have a question.
Yes.
About this.
Yes.
There's a lot of the history that's not covered here.
Of course. Yes.
And you know, it's all part of the greater movement.
Mm-hmm.
Because,
So
yeah,
you're getting to the point that I was about to get to, which is that. Sorry. Today's session, one thing we really wanted to capture is the many weaving stories that weave into Cooper Square's history and then weave back out into the neighborhood and other parts of the city. Like you said, this is one organization, but it's many people. And many people move in and out of the organization, and many people are influenced by it and have influenced it. So we want to capture Cooper Square's history, but not think of it as one singular line, but as something more complex. So without further ado, I'd love to start, and maybe we can go in order of the circle. And the first question I wanted to ask is how you became involved in Cooper Square. And if it was, I'll ask this one little piece, that if it was because of your housing situation, it'd be great to hear about that. And if it wasn't, then I'd love to hear how and why you got involved in Cooper Square.
I got involved in Cooper Square because my husband was the principal director of Cooper Square for many years, and automatically I became involved as a result of it.
I think he was the paid organizer.
The first paid organizer, right?
Yeah.
What was his name?
Bill Tatum. Bill Tatum.
Oh, Bill Tatum. Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
And how did you get in, and did you also become involved at that point?
I became involved especially in the events that we had. I helped organize them, and I was involved in any way that I could because I had my own job and my own functions away from Cooper Square.
And what year was that?
What year? 1964 is the year that I came into the organization.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Fran, can you tell us how you became involved in Cooper Square?
I was involved in the first urban renewal plan in the city, and it was, why am I blanking? 64th Street.
Oh, Lincoln Center.
It was Lincoln Center. And we fought it and we lost. And then the next one was Seward Park, which I lived across the street from on East Broadway. And we fought that and we lost. By that time, I realized that we can't say urban renewal sucks, we have to get rid of it. When Robert Moses came to the Lower East Side and saw our tenements on 3rd and 4th Street, and he walked to Wall Street, and it took him 20 minutes. He got this bright idea that he would tear down these crummy tenements with toilets in the hall and bathtubs in the kitchen. He put in people who would walk to Wall Street, to their jobs. And he just simply picked the wrong neighborhood. By then I had been through 2 failures with urban renewal. And this time I was ready for them.
You learned a lot.
We said to the city, we love urban renewal. We think it's marvelous, but we want it to be work for the people who live here, not throw them out. We wanted to, basically, we wanted to protect and benefit everyone who lives on the site. And if you can build a plan that will do that, we are for it. And at our very first meeting, somebody brought Walter Thabit to that meeting. He was down at City Hall. I can even remember his name, I think. And he told Walter that this was happening. And the first meeting, which was at Thelma Burdick's office and the Church of All Nations on the corner of Houston and 2nd Avenue. And Walter was at the first meeting. And he became our official planner. And the basis of the plan, it was twofold. Everyone who lived on the site would benefit from the plan, and there would be absolutely no dislocation. People might be moved from the back of the building to the front, or from one building to the one next door. No one would be relocated off the site, and no one has been. So that was the basis of the plan, that it would benefit, not burden, the people who live on the site.
And what was your role at the beginning?
I was an organizer. I was an organizer. And I'll tell you, when we beat Robert Moses, our little organization, people joined for $1 a year. That was 59 years ago. That was 54 years ago. It's still $1 a year to be a member of the Cooper Square Committee. We wanted everybody to be able to afford it. And if they didn't have $1, they could pay $0.25 for 4 months.
Thank you, Fran. That's great.
So when we were ready for Robert Moses, and when we beat him, we felt that we could change the world. If we could beat Robert Moses, who was the biggest, baddest planner in the world, and we didn't beat him once, we beat him twice. We beat him in Cooper Square, and we beat him on the expressway. He was going to make from Hudson River to the East River a 6-lane highway, as if Houston Street was not good enough. And he made a big plan. We beat him on that as well. We beat him twice, and we felt, if we can beat him, we're going to beat this plan. We can do anything. And we did. We did. I mean, it's the only one in the Northeast.
I'm gonna come back to you. I just want to get everyone to introduce themselves before we jump into it.
Okay.
And then it's gonna be chaos. Y'all gonna be interrupting each other left and right.
Okay, I'm Steve Herrick, and I actually came to Cooper Square through the Lower East Side Joint Planning Council back in '95. I was hired as a sort of consultant or freelancer to do a study of the area around Tompkins Square Park and look at the role of the banks in terms of promoting displacement. The fact that the banks were over leveraging a lot of the tenement buildings, and landlords, in order to cover their big mortgages, had to get rid of all the low-income, low-rent tenants. So that was a project that Ben Dulchin, who was the director at the time, came up with, and so he hired me to do that study. And I was working in the Cooper Square office because Joint Planning Council had an office there. So I got to know people at Cooper Square through that, and then that project actually got funded, but JPC was kind of falling apart at that point. So Val actually decided to take on the grant that we got from New York Foundation. The Joint Planning Council had gotten that grant, and they switched it over to Cooper Square. So that's how I ended up at Cooper Square.
Great, thank you.
I first got involved with the Cooper Square community back in second half of '72. Don't recall the exact month. Prior to 1972, I have been very much involved in the anti-Vietnam War, the draft resistance movement. Even though I was only 18 or 19, but we helped to organize the demonstration that took place in Chicago in '68. worked for different organizations. At one point, I think just prior to coming to work for Cooper Square Committee, I was working for the Harrisburg Defense Committee, which was a group that was working to help to free the Berrigans and also to remove them from a conspiracy trial that accused them of conspiring to kidnap Henry Kissinger, which was ludicrous on its face, but it cost a lot of money to defend them and to eventually prevail. And I came across, I knew about Cooper Square, but I came across Cooper Square walking by their storefront window, which was then on 2nd Avenue, 69 2nd Avenue.
What year?
It must have been 72. And I came across a sign, they were looking for an organizer. So I said, well, I've been doing it for free. Being paid for it is even better. And this was a period also when many people in the anti-war movement were going back to fundamental, what they call fundamental social occupations. And I was looking instead for a new way to involve myself. And I was living in the neighborhood then. I was living on Mott Street, just a few blocks away. So I inquired, went in, got interviewed by a number of people, including Francis. And I never thought they would hire somebody with a radical background like me. Little did I know about, the radical history of Cooper Square. And I was hired as an organizer. And from that point on, I don't know if I came right after Bill Tatum or there was someone in between, I don't recall. But we started organizing the buildings and creating tenants associations, organizing rent strikes for better services, which is a little bit strange because the plan then was to demolish the building, so the city didn't want to do any major upgrades. But we got the electrical system at 63 4th Street, for example, replaced because it was in bad shape, even though the building was at that point slated for demolition. And we were hoping to implement the Cooper Square alternate plan, except that we were hit by a few crises, the city's fiscal crisis, the state fiscal crisis.
The federal crisis was the first one.
Yeah, and the Nixon moratorium on housing, no more affordable housing to be developed until he came up with the Section 8 subsidy program for developers. So we had to fight, this ongoing war, and the fight that we were faced with, as Fran said, started with the federal, was the plan by Roger Starr of planned shrinkage, using the city's fiscal crisis to accomplish what urban renewal could not accomplish, because as Fran would point out later on, when you designate an area for urban renewal, you have to notify the residents of what you're doing, which gives people a chance to organize and to mobilize. Whereas under Roger Starr's revised urban renewal plan, all you had to do is to follow so-called natural processes, namely cutbacks in police protection, fire protection, okay? So the people would leave of their own free will.
What year was that?
That was the mid-70s. And I followed the medical model. If you have like an airplane crash and you have someone that's on the verge of dying and you have someone who has a broken arm, who do you help first? You help the person with a broken arm. So during the fiscal crisis, they concentrated their city resources on the better off communities. And they let the other communities go by the wayside. That's how we ended up with the crisis in Harlem, East New York, okay, the South Bronx, okay? All suffered major cutbacks in services, police and fire protection. So that was the period when we were faced with buildings being torched by landlords to collect insurance, okay? In some cases, tenants burning their apartments so they could move into public housing. That also, happened. But we fought back. The city stopped renting vacant units as they were required to do by the plan, so as to create enough vacancies so when the building was more than half vacant, they would do what's called consolidation and meld two buildings into one and demolish the other building. And we started moving in squatters, okay? So we eventually were able to prevail in the Cooper Square community, unlike the area east of Avenue A, where you see all these vacant lots and burnt out buildings because they weren't as well organized as we were. And that's just one facet. I guess I should stop by going for another two hours. I'll let Tito speak.
Well, my name is Tito Delgado. My involvement with Cooper Square has been evolving throughout the years. I'm a former site tenant of the Spora site, the urban renewal site over on Grand Street. And my family, along with over 2,000 families, were evicted, promised to come back, and it's been a 50-year war to get some affordable housing there. However, at the time, my politics were very narrow. My politics was Puerto Rican independence, Young Lords, and the Black Panthers, because that's what I knew. However, during the course of the years, I kept on seeing the Joint Planning Council, Cooper Square, and this sister organization called Met Council doing incredible work. And one time I decided that me and some friends would take this urban renewal building that was boarded up, and we tore down the tin and we moved people in and we swatted it. At that point, we went to Met Council, which was right down the block, right next to Cooper Square, and like I said, it's a sister organization. And I came to see if we can get repairs and services. What happens is I met Esther Ann, and what she gave me was a worldview.
What
So
year is that?
what Esther Rand was able to give me was a worldview rather than the narrow nationalism that I knew. Because basically she connected everything through the housing. It wasn't about just the Puerto Ricans and blacks being screwed. We were all being screwed. And she kind of made those connections for me, and the roles of the banks, and so forth. So out of Met Council, I became an organizer for Met Council, and I organized on the Lower East Side and East Harlem for a number of years. And then one day, after moving out of the Lower East Side and moving up to 21st Street and First Avenue, also city-owned building, we get up one morning and we see our building in the newspaper, and it says, "Building for sale." Well, we had no knowledge of this. Apparently, the city had planned to sell our building under the asset sales program, which was basically, you know, giving these buildings back to the developers after they had abandoned them and not paid taxes for 20 some odd years. So at that point, I reached out to Cooper Square, and I reached out to Francis, and I said, "We really need your help because we can't do this alone." And Francis said, "Look, you're not part of the catchment area, however, let's see what we can do." And they came and they helped us fight off the developers. We were able to stay in the building at affordable rents, and 30 families that would have been in shelters or sent to God knows where, I apologize. 30 families that would have been out in the street were saved from being evicted. And at that point I said, you know, this organization is great. This organization I want to be part of. And I started getting involved more directly in Cooper Square. And yeah, I'm very pleased that I have people of the same mind, that we can work together for the same goals, because trying to fight off these very powerful economic forces alone is impossible. But Cooper Square not only taught me how to fight, but how to win. So I'm very pleased about that.
When was that fight you were talking about? Because I don't think we have it up.
Which fight is that?
That fight
Your
against
building?
your building, 27th
Oh,
Street.
It was the late
what-
90s, right? 99?
Yeah,
Somewhere in the
98, yeah.
Yeah, somewhere in the 90s. Basically what
Can you pull that
happened,
up?
Yeah.
Around the 90s, just pop it up anywhere. Around the decade.
what happened was that
Oh, put it on the.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
can just pop it up.
what happened was that besides, you know, our building going for sale, one of our tenants in the building was mugged and killed in the building. And at that point I said, this is crazy. You know, I came out of, you know, a drug-infested building. I'm not going to allow this to happen again. And we organized a tenants association, and of course we went to Cooper Square. So we named the organization the Jerry Manning Tenants Association.
And it still exists today?
It still exists today, yeah.
Thank you. And what do you do now? Sorry, what does that do today, the group do today, the association?
Well, basically, right now we just won a 11-year battle with the developer, with the landlord, and we developed a independent condo, residential condo. So we are no longer under the thumb of the landlord. Before, what happened was Cooper Square was managing the building, but they
Cooper
didn't.
Square, MHA.
MHA was managing the building, but didn't own it. The owner was a developer named Capocho and L&M and BFC, a bunch of shell organizations. And basically what happened was that we, from our rent rolls, Cooper Square wound up paying all the bills, and the landlord just collected the money. So it was a very unfair arrangement. Even though we were in place, it was a very unfair arrangement. There was really not a lot of money to do repairs, and in many ways, Cooper Square MHA carried the building for a number of years. It got to the point where we got a victory on the Lower East Side from a city councilwoman named Margarita Lopez, and then Rosie Mendez, who helped us obtain some rights from HPD, because HPD basically was in bed with these developers. And we were able to wrangle some rights from them.
My name is Alicia Lewis Coleman. I am a resident at 10 Stanton Street, aka Thelma Burdick Apartments. Come in contact with Cooper Square Committee because of tenant organizing. Been a resident at 10 Stanton Street for maybe 28 years. Moved there in '85. My mom was a homesteader, and she actually had an accident and she fell through the floor, and that's how we ended up in Thelma Burdick. So I came to know Cooper Square through organizing, me being involved on a tenant association.
And you still live in Thelma Burdick?
Yes, I still live.
I remember I met you before and you told me about when you first moved in. I was wondering if you could just say a few words about Thelma Burdick building.
Wow, when we first moved in Thelma Burdick, I thought it was paradise. It was like a dream come true, because we lived in tenements on 13th Street and in and out of various landlords that were really slumlords. And my mom was, like I said, she was a homesteader, so she was working for an apartment she had to gut it. She had to put the walls up, she had to put the floors down, and she did it with a group of other residents that were in the same situation. They thought they would be homeowners. They took over the buildings, and this was like through Project Appleseed that Jimmy Carter started. And at that time, it was a really great thing. So when we moved into Thelma Burdick, it was kind of like my mom had the thought that our apartments, after 20 years, we would be homeowners. We thought that we would become an MHA as well, and that didn't happen for us. But I didn't know any of that. I didn't know any of those things as a kid coming up. We just knew that we had a really big backyard and really nice equipment, and we had great neighbors. We had garden spaces. We could garden fruits and vegetables if we wanted to grow stuff in the backyard, and we had just really good connections with our neighbors. And pretty much the landlord was okay, at the time, but Cooper Square was actually in the building. They were actually there on site. They had a social worker on site to help anyone that was in need of whatever, if they needed connection with other community organizations, or if there was a need for, if if you had a need for your family, you could go and talk to the social worker that was on site, provided by Cooper Square, and they had an office in the building, in the first floor. So I mean,
That was Jasmine Garcia.
yes, yes.
Mm.
She's wonderful, and and we miss her. But yes, so
What
that,
year was this?
this was in '85, and we had that from, I think we had Cooper Square had an office there for maybe 10 years, right? Roughly, right, Val?
Something like that. yeah.
Something, maybe a little less, but it was.
Yeah,
I know they were there for quite a while, and they helped quite a few of the residents there. A lot of our neighbors are Asian and Pacific Islanders, and then we have a lot of Hispanic neighbors also. So I'm sure that a lot of people had to take advantage of the services because many of them did not speak English, and they were, you know, relatively new to that type of setting. So it's a Section 8 based project. If I didn't mention that, it's one of those type of situations where it's 30% of the household income, and that's how they budget. They have to budget around 30% of the household's income in order to come up with the rent amount.
So your building ended up a little bit different, but I guess we'll come back to that in a second. But now that we've done a round, thank you all for introducing yourself. I wanted to throw it out to you. When I went to the board meeting to propose to do this session, Val had a really ingenious suggestion, or a comment that I think was a really good suggestion, which was that you made an observation that Cooper Square had influenced the creation of a series of other organizations in the neighborhood. Members had left and created their own organizations, or Cooper Square had catalyzed the creation of something. And so I now wanted to open up the floor to talk about these catalyzed people's organizations, either just the topic, if you'd like to reflect on it, or talk about a specific story of an organization being created, or another sort of path of activity happening, because I feel like that's part of the history that's maybe not been told.
Mhm.
Does that make sense, Fran?
Yeah.
I don't quite, I'm not grasping the purpose that you're looking for.
Well, just sort of how Cooper Square has spawned other organizations or played a lead
Okay.
role in creating them.
Because it's not just one organization, sort of. There's been a lot of broader activity, and I
Right.
want to just make sure I capture that.
I think an easy way to start that, Francis, is Cooper Square Committee's focus, pretty much single focus, was on the issue of affordable housing. The alternate plan, trying to get funding for it, trying to keep the families from being displaced. But a community has many needs, and it's not just affordable housing. And particularly, you know, being right by the Bowery, one important need was the need of the homeless population on the Bowery. People living in what were then flop houses, now they're becoming hostels or luxury hotels. And there was nothing addressing those needs. So the Cooper Square Committee hired an organizer, his name is John Tusa, who started a committee of the Cooper Square Committee called the Bowery Residents Committee. I may be mistaken, but I think that was the first spin-off of the Cooper Square Committee. And
What
it
year
was
was that?
it must have been 71, I guess, 71, 72, roughly around that time. Maybe a little bit before my time. I'm continuing while I was employed at Cooper Square Committee, and it was a committee of Cooper Square. And as you called out, one of its founding members, besides John, was also Walter Thabit. We have somewhere the original minutes of the first meeting, handwritten, I think, in Walter's handwriting. The Bowery Residents Committee then later on expanded again through the work of John Tusa, who's a forgotten figure, although he's still around. I still have his business card. He's a social worker now. And eventually, with the help of Cooper Square Committee, we were able to get a grant, and they were able to rent a small storefront space, which became the headquarters for the Bowery Residents Committee. And subsequent to that, it grew exponentially to the point where I was looking at their budget only some number of years ago, and their surplus was bigger than the entire Cooper Square Committee budget, okay? And they've gone through some changes. I'm not exactly thrilled with all the changes they've gone through. At one point, they changed their name from the Bowery Residents Committee to the BRC, Human Services Corporation. Then it went back to the original name. it was controlled by Bowery residents. Now it has a board that's very much like a corporate board. But that being said, it's still providing quality services for homeless people and people with drugs and alcohol
They have
problems.
millions of dollars
Yes.
of operating expenses.
Right. And Cooper Square also organized what was then called the Good Food Co-op. Now they changed their names because they were concerned about quality food being delivered to our community. And then it goes on, you know, there's a lot of history to be covered.
When the zoning wanted to change to R10, so
Right.
that they could build taller buildings, we developed the Bowery residents, the
The Third Avenue
Third Avenue.
Artisan Tenants
Yeah,
Association.
and it was a separate organization.
Right.
And they defeated the R10 plan
Right.
for Third Avenue. So all of these were committees of Cooper Square that became standing entities on their own, like the food co-op.
Right.
That was a committee of Cooper Square. It's now a food co-op. They would change. They were part of us, and we built them up to be independent on their own.
Right.
And we were very proud of that.
What was the reason to start creating these other organizations? What was the purpose?
The need in the community, they came to us and they became a committee of Cooper Square. It was just became another committee, like the Good Food Co-op, or fighting R10 on Third Avenue. And then when it got stronger and bigger, it went off on its own, like the
Right.
Bowery Residents Committee.
Right.
That's separate organizations. We get them, give them a start, and then they become independent, which was fine with us.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that that was one of the attractive things about, and still is, attractive thing about Cooper Square, that it's not just about the buildings on 4th Street and 5th Street. It's about all issues that concern the community, from peace issues to anti-fracking issues to developers gobbling up the community. That really was the most attractive and is the most attractive thing about Cooper Square, that it doesn't see itself as just this entity with these buildings. It sees itself as a force for affordable housing, for peace and justice, for just to do the right thing in our community based on the community's needs. I hope we never lose that mandate, that mission. But that is really the real heart and soul of Cooper Square, that it sees the whole picture and the need to build institutions to support the community, the need to build movements to fight off developers, etc. The Federal Credit Union was one of the things that Cooper Square was involved in.
Right.
The People's, Lower East Side People's Federal Credit Union. At the time I was a member, I was a new member of Community Board 3, and I remember this ongoing discussion, ridiculous discussion, about not naming it the People's Federal Credit Union. And, you know, it was crazy because, you know, some of the backward forces on the board accused people of being a cabal, you know, because we said we wanted to be called the People's Federal, Lower East Side People's Federal Credit Union, so that people feel that it's theirs. Anyway,
the bank to
right,
give us
it
the
was a whole
building.
bank, right?
We got the bank to give us
Manufacturers
the
Hanover
building.
Bank.
What?
It was Manufacturers Hanover Bank.
Right.
Yes.
We got, our credit union is in the bank building. We own the bank building. It was
Can
amazing.
you tell me how it came to be and why?
I think
Well-
Manny was closing the branch in 1986, I believe it was.
And we had no bank in the neighborhood.
Within a 100 square block area, there was no other financial institution at that point. And that meant that people that had to cash their pension checks or had to get access to funding would have had to go outside the neighborhood to go there. And Manufacturers Hanover Bank said, well, we're not making any money from this branch, this is why we're closing it. We found out that The reason we weren't making any money is they have been making risky loans to dictatorship, like the dictatorship in Brazil and other places, that was, taking up their funds. So we organized the community, and we filed a Community Reinvestment Act challenge to the bank.
That's right.
And that brought them to the negotiating table.
We went to the Pope. We went to the Pope.
We met with the Cardinal.
It was
yes.
very colorful.
Cardinal.
Tell us about it, Mary. What happened?
We petitioned the Pope, and the Archdiocese of New York got involved with us.
Yeah, we had a meeting with the Cardinal. I'm sorry. This is not about the credit union. It's about rent stabilization. Another struggle. Sorry. I'll take it back.
They get mixed up.
Yes.
What year was this? The credit union.
I don't remember.
I think it started in
The 80s.
'86.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just remember
It was
being
around
a
that
kid
time.
and my mom said I had to have my first bank account with them. I just remember that
Okay.
getting
Right.
my summer job, and my mom was like, "We're going to the credit union to open up your bank account. This is your first bank account I ever had." And to this day, I'm still a member of that credit union. And my kids, I made them become members of the credit union
Right.
as well, because I said this is a bank for the people, owned by the people. So that's why it was so important
It's
to
the
be a
only
part.
bank that will open up accounts for homeless people. They will
Yes.
take accounts. Like if you have no place to receive your mail or your Social Security check, they will receive it for you.
Yeah.
And a cool new point is that they just partnered with the credit union in Lower East Side. I mean, sorry, in the East Harlem,
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
and that's where the new land.
It's a great.
They've been with East Harlem for a while though. They've been with them for a good little while now. They branched out. Another branch out.
I wanted to ask if anyone could tell the story of the Joint Planning Council. Oh wow.
In less than 2 hours? Or less than
An introduction to what do we need to know about the Joint Planning Council? How
I think
it
Fran
created
is the
and why?
best spokesperson for that.
Yeah.
There were two. I was one of the founders, but Cooper Square became part of it. There was an incredible guy named Ernesto Martinez,
Oh, yes.
and he was an amazing organizer. And he has 3 daughters, of which I became their godmother. But he was also Carter made him a member of the Committee for the Aging, and he used to go to Washington to those meetings. He was an incredible organizer. As a matter of fact, he got Mariana Brachetti and Campos Plaza built.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them was thousands of units, and one of them was a lot of units on 4th Street. But he was a marvelous organizer. And he and I, and what's her name who died? Carol
Watson.
Watson.
Yes.
Decided to start the Lower East Side Joint Planning Council and pull together all the good little organizations all over the East Side into one organization we could help each other.
Right.
And Ernesto and Carol and I were the founders of that organization.
What year was that?
I don't remember.
What decade? 70s?
I-
70s probably.
70s.
Yeah,
I
sometime
think
in
it
the early
was the
70s.
70s,
Yeah,
right.
early 70s.
And whenever we had an issue that like planned shrinkage, any issue that affected the whole neighborhood,
Right,
we'd pull together all the organizations and take actions,
right.
or sit-ins, or marches, or whatever. And it lasted about 12 years, or
Well,
maybe,
maybe longer. It's, maybe in mid-80s is when it.
I don't know why it dissolved, but it,
Well, it still had
Well-
a staff up until the mid-90s. But
yeah.
There were, and that is a complicated story. It was very active. It had many groups, Met Council, the BRC, Community Access, East Americans for Equality, Cooper Square Community, Pueblo Nuevo, Action
it had
for
lots.
Progress, and so on and so on. One thing that sort of caused its demise, accidentally, you could say, it was a success when we were able to win an agreement with the city, which was the 50-50 plan. That the city agreed to renovate 1,000 units of affordable housing in the east of Avenue A, Loisaida, in exchange for an equal number of what was then market rate units, which we swallowed with great disgust. And a number of groups that previously had been focusing on organizing decided they were now developers and started working more on their individual agendas rather than looking upon governmental grants for housing the way you looked upon food stamps. You can only use the money for one purpose only, and the reason you got it in the first place is because we organized the community. So then we had, of course, the destructive impact of our soon-to-become council member who was given a position director of one of the groups. And then we started working across purposes, and eventually
But
the coalition became
every-
fragmented.
Right. Every piece of vacant land that were on the Lower East Side
Right.
went to people for the blind, people for the aged. We filled it with organizations that were ready to put a lot of money in to take care of people who were poor. And we were able to do that. We were able to do that.
And we thought strategically. For example, Francis mentioned Carol Watson, okay? And the part of the deal we didn't like was our agreement to market rate housing, you know, which we felt we had to agree on to get the money. So we worked together. We won the right to identify the locations for the market rate housing. This in the mid-'80s. And the location we picked out were all adjacent to low-income housing projects. So when time came that the city issued RFPs, at that point in time, there were no takers to the market rate housing. So what was supposed to become market rate housing was developed as middle income housing, which is not as bad, and it's something that's needed because our community is not just low income, it's low, moderate, and middle income. But that was Carol's input, you know, that strategically made a lot of sense.
Also, it's very interesting to know that during that period, there were a bunch of young Turks who were occupying buildings.
Right.
And there were 100 buildings occupied because there were hundreds of vacant buildings.
Right.
And they were occupied by young people who brought in tenants and they took over the buildings. 100 of them. 100 of them. Every fucking one of them has become private. I'm glad that she's dead. She would have turned over in her grave if she worked so hard to get those buildings co-opted by plain people. Every one of them has been sold for money.
That's because they didn't have a community land trust.
That really made us realize that if we didn't have a community land trust, we would go the way of every other building. People decided to move to Puerto Rico or to go wherever, and they grabbed the money for their little apartment, which they made out of garbage into livable, and it became private. Every one of them is private. That's why we survived, because we have a community land trust. They fixed the plumbing. They got the electricity working. Some of these people had skills. They moved in tenants. They moved in not only white people, but Hispanics and black people. It was, and 100 of them, 100 buildings were taken over by squatters. Mm-hmm. And then they realized that they had turned this into a livable apartment house. And little by little, they didn't have a Cooper Square leadership.
Yeah.
They sold their apartments for money, lots of money. And they moved.
How did they get ownership of the buildings? The city gave them
Through
ownership?
struggle, through working with the city. In most of these buildings, they might have gotten each $10,000 to do basic repairs from the city, as we did. We got $50,000. Our plan was to build public housing on Houston Street. Public housing. And we had the building planned. It was a building that was built like this, a bit on Houston Street. That's the building. It was going to be very skinny. Every building was going to have through ventilation. Every apartment had windows on both sides. That was the original plan. And then the federal housing went belly up. And we had no more public housing. So it took us years to get state funding. And then the state went belly up. And they had no housing. I mean, a 54-year struggle. Then we had to say, okay, now we have to go back to the city. And these buildings have toilets in the hall. 9 people for one toilet with no sink. A toilet, that's it. And everybody in that apartment used that one toilet. Bathtubs in the kitchen. No toilets in the apartments. So first we were going to have public housing, then we were going to have state housing. Now we should go back to the city and say, you've got to renovate these apartments. If we have 20 buildings, 20 apartments, 4 of them are overcrowded. You have to make 16 apartments. You have to make 3 big apartments because there's a lot of people in that family. So the building, which had 20 apartments, became 16 apartments because nobody was going to be overcrowded in the new apartment. You understand? So it cost them $50,000 an apartment to put in new floors, hardwood floors, brand new kitchens with complete wonderful sink stoves and refrigerators. Every apartment had what he called a 3-piece bathroom. A toilet, a sink, and a bathtub with a shower, or a shower. A 3-piece bathroom. The city paid $50,000, kicking and screaming. But they'd kick and scream and we demonstrate. And they'd kick and scream and we would not pay the rent. And we pushed them. They renovated every single apartment. And also big enough for the families. And we didn't pay a dime. What we did was pay our energy in fighting that they had to do this. You got us into this mess, you're going to get us out of it. That's why it took 54 years.
I just want to ask that one last question. The buildings that were squatted and became in the neighborhood, you said there were 100 buildings that got squatted, and then the tenants got ownership from the city. What happened to them and what did that teach you? What did that teach Cooper Square? What lesson?
It taught us that if we didn't
Could you
have...
tell the story, just quickly, that little piece of it? Because I want to make sure
Carol Watson is turning over in her grave because she made these places
Right.
co-ops.
Right.
It's just that I can see it happening in Cooper Square. People are greedy.
It's the culture.
It's the culture of the 1%. Everybody wants to be the 1%.
Everybody wants to
We
be
didn't do that. I want to tell you that the people in this buildings, they have been trained that if they see 2 men in suits with a clipboard, everybody's been trained. You go up to that person and you say, "Who are you? What are you doing on our block?" "Oh, we're just writing down numbers." "No, you can't write down numbers. We own these buildings. They're not for sale. We want you to get your ass out of this building, and we have a big dog, and he's going to make sure that he takes a piece of your ass if you don't move fast." And they are told to stop these people and tell them to get the fuck off this building, off this block.
There used to be a big banner on 4th Street that says "Speculators keep out." Big, huge banner.
Yeah, right. Cooper Square is here today to stay. Speculators keep away.
out. Yeah.
And it was the apartments on this side of the street and the apartment on that side of the street. The banners was tied to their building, and we have a lot of pictures of that wonderful sign. And the tenants know that they're not safe because this trend to turn us into Hong Kong is ongoing. What's his fuck is our last, what Bloomberg did to this city was unconscionable. You know, the blue building,
On Delancey in North.
what has been done to this neighborhood, which is it's a low neighborhood, no more. I mean, he didn't give a shit about the people who live here or the history. The history of this neighborhood is world renowned. It's the only neighborhood in the world, and I'm not kidding, that has Jews, Italians, Russians, blacks, Chinese, Puerto Ricans living not in separate buildings, but in the same building. And what united them was poverty.
Right.
They were all
That's
poor.
right,
And
that's
when
right.
they're all poor and somebody couldn't pay the rent, there would be a party,
Yeah.
and they'd raise the money and pay the rent because they were united by poverty.
Right.
And it meant all the trade union leaders came from the Lower East Side. The settlement house leaders came from the Lower East Side.
The public housing.
Yes,
from those.
the first public housing was First Houses, and the second one was Harlem. That was the first public housing. Ours still exists. It's incredible housing. They would take 2 buildings and tear down the third, leave 2 buildings standing, tear down the third, to make the buildings roomy and big. That was First Houses, the first public housing in the city. And it remains today, and you fight to get an apartment in that building.
LaGuardia.
Oh, please, yeah.
No, LaGuardia is the one who was responsible for First Houses.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes,
LaGuardia.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah, we had an incredible mayor. I think that the new mayor's going to learn from LaGuardia.
Well,
if he's-
I just want to say one thing on public housing that we're on it for a minute. There's an attempt by NYCHA now to privatize public housing.
Absolutely.
And they're targeting the Lower East Side and East Harlem. And it's no coincidence that the buildings they're targeting are buildings with Riverview. It's called the infill plan, and I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but basically what NYCHA is saying, and HUD, what they're saying is that this plan would lease the space, like the playgrounds, the senior centers, the park benches, in public housing,
Parking lots, open
the
space.
parking lot. They will lease it for 99 years, like the Panama Canal, to private developers for luxury housing. And Cooper Square is part of that struggle and that fight back against that at this point. And it's, it's really a David and
We're
it's
winning. We're winning that.
It's really a David and Goliath fight because, the powers that be want this land. It's the only land that's not developed in Manhattan. It's the land on public housing, and they want it. So there's a big fight back by public housing tenants, by Cooper Square, by an organization called Good Old Lower East Side to fight that.
I wanted to ask, you mentioned before that the thing that brought people together in the beginning was their poverty.
Was what?
Their
poverty.
Yeah, right.
I wanted to ask you, if and when, what split people apart?
You mean with the 100?
And in the history, what were the things that made it hard to work together? What were the things that created tension between the different people's organizations and people in the neighborhood?
It's a hard question.
No, landlords undermining people. They would go behind.
You mean
people's
the Lower
back
East
and
Side Joint Planning Council?
No.
offer money to individual
it's
families.
a culture,
to
yeah.
leave.
Just in general, because there were people in some cases were united by their poverty and their need to protect their housing.
Well, that's our experience
Yeah.
in Cooper Square.
And I'm wondering if there were things that made it hard for people to work together
Well,
in certain moments.
can I tell you my experience about that? I grew up in a tenement on the Lower East Side where there were 30 apartment units. Out of those 30 apartment units, 14 of them were different nationalities and different races. And Francis is absolutely right. What united us was our poverty. Even though it was first generation and our parents didn't speak the same language, we all got along because of the poverty that united us. I think the answer to your question about what divided us, in my experience, has been gentrification. And I'll explain that. When this neighborhood was abandoned, the white people that came in that were not raised here were basically artists. And they immersed themselves in the community. They became part of the community. We know them back then as hippies, but they became part of the community. They immersed themselves in the community. This new wave of people want nothing to do with the community. They build their own institution to be separate from the community. And that's what's dividing us. What's dividing us is class. It's a class issue. And that's the way I've seen it throughout the years here, that this new wave of people are no longer poor working class immigrants, or even working class people, or even artists that immerse themselves in the community. They're basically spoiled, well-to-do people who are coming in and don't want anything to do with the community. They don't want to be part of the community. They just want to live in the community. So that's the way I've been watching this.
Yeah, we call it the haves versus the have-nots.
Yeah.
And that I noticed a lot of that when my kids were in elementary school, and they would be in the Nest school that was built, and that was a school I felt like it divided the whole community, because it was like you had wealthy kids coming from out of the community being car serviced into the community, and then you have one of my children went to a local school in right on 3rd Street, the neighborhood school, and it was, you know, just kids in the neighborhood. Everybody in the same community, everybody seeing each other at the park, gathering together. But then you saw the other half, the other side, where they wanted the children to wear a uniform, and they wanted the children to talk a certain way. They didn't want the children to associate with the children in the projects. And I said, what? Right. When I found that out, I was disgusted. But it goes back to the haves versus the have-nots. And that's where we are right now. Right. It is a lot of people that are coming in. You see it in the community board. They come to the community board meetings when they want to open up a restaurant or a bar, because that's the most popular thing right now. Everybody wants to open up a bar. So you're opening up bars, but they're not for the people within our community. There's a lot of people, there's an influx that are coming into the community. And so now they're purchasing apartments or property so that they can create their own society.
Right.
And that's where we are right now.
Right. It's a class
And
issue.
charter schools are a part of the devastation,
Yes.
ruining our education completely.
Yeah, I think one of the early things like backlashes against Cooper Square was like a group like BASTA that formed, which I think stood for Before Another Shelter Tears Us Apart. But BASTA also was a Spanish word for enough, but it was like they were trying to make it seem like it was like, you know, the Latino community was against some of the things that Cooper Square was doing. There were efforts to, you know, to get people opposed to the work that we were doing to preserve affordable housing. And BASTA was against the shelter on 3rd Street in the Bowery, which was badly run by the city, and Cooper Square fought to get it put in the hands of a nonprofit that manages it much better, because there was drug trafficking going on and problems happening on the block, but it's a much better run shelter now.
But the people behind Basta was Antonio Pagan, who was backed by the real estate developers. Right. So even though they had a Latino name, the reality is it was sponsored and financed by real estate developers.
Yeah, but the purpose of BASTA was not against any of the real estate situation. We were, I was part of BASTA, and we had a siege on 3rd Street that was unbelievable because of the drug infestation at the time. This was in the 1980s, where the people were being bussed from jails right to 3rd Street, and they were they didn't have anywhere to go, so they hung around. The drug situation was unbelievable. There was drugs being sold right in front of your eyes as you were walking up and down the street. It was quite a scene. So BASTA started primarily because of the drug situation. And we fought the city on that. We had a court case on it, and BASTA won. And finally, the municipal men's shelter had to be disbanded, and it became, it was taken over by private organizations that were not-for-profit, like, forget the names,
Renewal.
Project Renewal. And it became much, much better for a very, very long time. As time went on, it has also deteriorated. It goes up and down depending on who's in charge and what the city's situation is in terms of funding. Because even though there was no more busing, and the people that came to it was a drug rehab center, and we were all in favor of this drug rehab center as residents of the area. Started out absolutely magnificently. And as time went on, the city started putting in more and more people that came off the street from different areas, and a lot of drugs started coming in again, and just became very, it became dysfunctional again.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, it's sort of in between.
Mm-hmm. And this period with, I've heard a lot about this period with Pagan causing a lot of tension. And I was wondering if someone might be able to tell about that moment where the Latino community was sort of swept up in that, pulled in multiple directions in that moment in history.
I didn't know that it was the Latino community that was involved. It was,
No,
everybody was involved.
It was just a Latino name, but it was not necessarily the Latino community. It
Right.
made it
Yeah,
appear,
they tried to create the
it
appearance.
made
of what was
it
there.
appear that it was the Latino community against it. But in reality, it wasn't. It was not the majority of the Latino community, because many of the family and relatives lived in those shelters. But it did split the community, and I'm not saying there wasn't a problem there, but the problem, as I saw it, was that it was an attempt to use this organization by the real estate industry to make the neighborhood more gentrificational, more feasible for gentrification. There were problems.
Yeah, for
There
two
are
years.
problems.
For 2
But
years.
the answer was not to gentrify the community using front groups and phony Latino names to basically saying, not in my backyard, rather than saying, let's fund them properly so that they can run a proper organization. So that was my read on it.
When
Because-
Pagan was our councilman for 2 years, Cooper Square had a thing that came before the Board of Estimate. And
Oh, yes.
I forget the issue, but it wasn't important. It was, maybe it was having the city pay for renovating all the apartments and making them sound. And we knew how to organize. And we went to 50 members of the council, individually, met with them, left them documents about why we needed them to vote for us.
Oh, this was for the ULUR. This was for
The
the
ULUR.
selling,
Right.
authorizing the city to sell all the MHA buildings.
Right,
Yeah,
To
right.
us,
that's it.
Yeah, the ULUR, right. And we met with 50 state city council people. And then there was a vote. We were all there with shirts that were one.
Yellow, bright yellow. And,
Vote for this.
yeah.
And 49 council people voted no,
Voted in favor of this.
voted in favor of our plan. And Pagan was the only one who voted against it.
And he was our council person.
And they,
It was his
council
district.
people defer to the council
They
person on
usually
the
do.
site.
Right, right.
Now,
Just sort of have a little respect for
Pagan
that.
was really not that important in the BASTA situation. It was Howard Helmsley who was the head of it.
Mm-hmm.
And he was very, very effective.
Well,
That's what, that's from where I was standing.
Mhm.
All right.
And so what impact did Pagan have on the feeling of the residents in terms of?
Well, he lasted 2 years,
That's it.
and then
I
he
think
was.
4.
Then
Wasn't
he
it
died.
91 and 95?
Oh,
Yeah, because then Margarita
2
came
years?
in.
then Margarita came in and
And
replaced
he
him.
was pro speculators and pro privatization. I mean, basically, he tried to push that Cooper Square be a privatization kind of deal where the tenants could sell their apartments, and he tried to stack the board, and there was big struggles back and forth, and we won out.
I'll never forget a public meeting that we had in Cooper Square where Pagan got up and he said, I had just spoken, and he said, our local communist doesn't agree with me. He said, she's trying to bring Lenin and Stalin into this organization. So just know who you're dealing with here, he said. I disagree with her. I don't think that what she's doing in Cooper Square is right. And I think the rest of you are with me. I want my piece of the rock. I want my apartment to be mine, and I want to be able to sell it whenever I want to sell it for as much money as I can get. So, do you want this Leninist person here, or do you want you to join me and have your piece of the rock? And he was defeated so profoundly at that meeting. I don't even live on the site, you know, I'm near it, but I'm not on the site. So.
But his house did become a co-op.
Yeah, he lived at
He
7
became a
East
co-
3rd Street, and his was the only building that voted not to become part of the MHA
And it's-
project.
right.
And so they went to the TIL program, which doesn't have the same kind of restrictions.
Right. That's the only building that's not part of this whole Cooper Square.
And they got tons of money from the city because he was a city council to fix up his apartment. Tons.
What about 32 East 2nd Street? Is that part of your group? Or is that also an independent
No,
group?
that's a private co-op. I don't think that was
Private
a
co-op?
city-owned building, though. I think that just went co-op on its own.
We
That was
have,
across the
that's
street from
we have a building on the corner of 5th Street and 2nd Avenue. It has 6 apartments. Each floor is 3 bedrooms.
How lovely.
And that's ours. Yeah.
We've already talked about one of the moments where privatization happened of buildings.
Say that again?
We already talked about one moment with the squatting buildings where buildings were privatized, but I wanted to ask another question. I know that the Thelma Burdick building is a private building, and I wanted to ask if we could just hear a little bit about that and try to capture that story of what happened with that, because I know it was developed by Cooper Square, but it's a private building and there's been complications with that. With
Yes.
it not being owned by the community. Because I know that Alicia has to leave, and I just wanted to capture that story from
Yeah,
her quickly, and then we can continue to chat.
I don't know that I could tell you a whole lot about it because when it went down, I was still relatively young, and I actually am learning more now than I knew when it actually happened. Because at the end of our 20-year lease of what we thought we had on the land, someone help me here, it was a 20-year lease that was on the land that was a public or what was it called?
Well, the Section 8 contract was 20 years.
Yeah, the Section 8 contract was 20 years, but there was something with the land, that the land was leased to the owners, and something happened when the land got switched over, when it went from being leased to then being owned by the owners. Whatever happened, whatever transpired, we didn't know as a resident that happened, and the landlord had some kind of ownership that was switched over, and from that point on, we've been terrorized by this management agent and their group, a group of owners that pretty much they run, you know, what we do and what we don't do. So I mean, now they sold our backyard recently, and we as a residents felt as though we had no say-so in that, and the only way to get say-so in that is that we had to basically negotiate for ourselves. And with Cooper Square's help, we had to get Cooper Square involved in it also, to sit with us and help us and make sure that we knew what we were doing and make sure we were getting a good contract, just to say that we could get some green space, or the living conditions wouldn't be too compromised for the residents there. So it's horrible. Because we thought we were going to be homeowners, and then.
And why were you not? What made your building possible that didn't allow you?
You know, I really don't know too in depth about what happened, because it all happened behind closed doors.
It was developed as project-based Section 8 housing, so that was the funding model that existed back in the early 80s when Cooper Square got the financing and worked with the Glick organization to develop it. So unlike in more recent years where a lot of affordable housing has been developed using low-income tax credits, where there's sort of an exit strategy where the investors, after 15 years or so, can get out of the picture, and you can then convert the building into potentially a co-op or keep it as a low-income rental. In this case, the ownership really rests with, Cooper Square doesn't have any ownership stake in the building, so it was owned totally by the Glick organization. Then it was passed down to family members. Now it's basically like a limited liability company with multiple partners, and we've dealt with them to some extent, but mainly we're dealing directly with management rather than the owners, except in the case of when the land behind the building was sold. The tenants did have some leverage in that situation, because when the building was built, they actually had to go to Board of Standards and Appeals because the building went straight up instead of being set back. So there was some administrative, like a variance basically, that was put in place. And in order for them to sell this property and build this hotel next door, they had to come to the tenants and get them to sort of sign off on allowing them to do that. And the tenants could have tried to litigate, and we brought in attorneys to actually help, but they said, you could litigate and we'll help you, but chances are you're going to lose. Because the building is essentially being built as of right, there's no height limits on that particular block. This all gets a little complicated. This area that block wasn't included in the rezoning.
It's very sad that they had to give up.
Yeah. So, and instead they got a benefits agreement where their affordable housing is being preserved for another 20 years, and now they're actually talking about extending it even further.
In exchange for what?
In exchange for not opposing the hotel, basically.
Yeah.
There's going to be a not necessarily a hotel, but a luxury building.
Some kind of luxury developed building there.
On the corner.
And you know, honestly, we felt like our backs were against the wall on this whole situation here, because it was like, again, it goes back to the haves versus the have-nots. And they have all these lawyers that came and bombarded us, and it was kind of like they bullied us into a situation. And we had to do what was best
to stay in your apartments.
To stay in our apartments and to negotiate. I mean, the first thing we asked for was ownership. Can we just purchase our building? You can do whatever you want with the backyard, but can we purchase our building so that we can have 146 units where people can have this affordable housing for the next whenever 99 years or what have you? That's the first thing we thought about, and immediately we were told no way, because it's a cash cow. You know, it's HUD gives them money, they preserve the affordable housing, affordable to whom, for some people, because they're as you age up, your children graduate from college, they get better jobs, they live in the house, they can't move out because they got to pay student loans. Where you going? So and your rent goes 30% of your household income. So if your kid is making $40,000, $50,000 a year, you're making $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year. Do the math on 30%. So you're almost paying market rate anyway.
In order to stay there for the next 20 years, they had to agree to this damn high-rise on the corner of Houston Street. That's too bad, but that's what happened.
Yeah, it's going to be on the back block of Christie. It will be on Christie Street, actually.
I want to just interject some. Thank you so much. I know you have to head out.
Thank you. I'll
really
be back.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, I really love this quote. It's about oral history, and it sort of relates to why I think today is really important. And it says, oral history is a framework from which to reimagine the world, first by remembering it, second by naming it, and third by renaming it through the conversion of words into action. It's that idea that understanding that history, we can put it into action. We can put those lessons. And I wanted to ask you all, as really sort of like elders in this community who have so much experience from having been through all these struggles and contributing quite a bit to them, but also through that experience learned many lessons. What lessons need to be pulled forward?
Well, I like to answer that because it just, Alicia just, you know, talked about her building. It just goes to show you, and at least what I've learned, that the private sector will never give a working person an opportunity. Will always have their foot on the necks of poor working people. That only through public domain, such as the community land trust, where people cannot speculate, where apartments stay affordable in perpetuity, can we stabilize and the community and have housing affordable for everyone. Because the speculators and the real estate lobbies rule this city, and like I said, the private sector will never give a working man a break.
I think that if we didn't have a community land trust, we wouldn't be where we are today. There's no doubt about it. I can see murmurings in the new board
Right.
that how can we get into the community land trust? Can we approve who is on the community land trust? I see glimmerings of taking over
Right.
our
Some people call themselves
permanent
stockholders.
affordability. I mean, 198 years is a pretty long time, but that's what we're guaranteed only because of a community land trust. And it's inevitable, I think, that the city will go to hell. It'll all be luxury housing if we didn't have a community land trust. And I don't think it's a system that people know about. I don't think they understand what it means. And we're working very hard with de Blasio to make him understand that the only way you'll have permanent affordability is either public housing or a community land trust. And if we're pioneers in this, God bless us, because I know because of the group, what's the group uptown?
Picture the homeless, we're helping them.
They know how important it is. They're fighting for it in their neighborhood. It's the only way that we can. That and public housing is the only way we're going to house people who are not rich.
Can you tell me why you learned why that was necessary? How you learned why that was necessary?
We were just lucky. When we started in 1959, we had a lawyer. And that lawyer, now I'm blocking,
Berger. Martin Berger?
Martin Berger said, if you want permanent affordability, you have to have a community land trust. And we said, what is a community land trust? We didn't have an inkling what it was. And he explained what it was. He said the cooperators own the apartments, and the community land trust people own the land. So that if the people who are now living in the buildings get together and they decide, well, they've been through this struggle for many years and maybe it's time for us to move to Puerto Rico or something. And they come to us and say, we'd like to change the plan. And we say, do you have a majority? And they say, we do. We have a majority of people. Okay. You own the buildings, that's true. But I consider the people in the Community Land Trust the conscience of this plan. We own the land. So, if the majority of you want to do it, take your building and move it to Puerto Rico, or move it to Staten Island. And they say, well, what are you, crazy? How do you move a building? And, well, that's your problem. That's not our problem. That's your problem. It's the only way to keep it permanently affordable. And God bless him, Marty Berger, because we didn't even know what it meant when he said, you have to base it on a community land trust. But he's the one who wrote it into our bylaws. And all I hope is that it spreads throughout the city and throughout the country, because it's the only way to keep rents affordable.
On that, remember when Francis talked about the 100 buildings that were squatted, sweat equity, different plans? They all went private. Every one of them. So there's no more affordability there. They're $1 million apartments, $500,000 apartments. Why? Because they didn't have a community land trust to guarantee that it stays affordable for the community.
Yeah, Cooper Square actually is working with some of those buildings now. We're doing this weatherization work, which we did a number of MHA buildings, but we've been expanding and going to them. And some of them we're finding that the majority of the residents in them are still low income. And it'd be great if we could figure out a way to get them to maybe consider buying into the land trust model. And
That's interesting.
If we can find some of them where there's enough still low income people in them and see a benefit to themselves. Some of them, unfortunately, the majority of the residents now, the households are more affluent, and so we can't enroll them in weatherization, and they're not interested in really working with us. So, but we're trying to do outreach and find buildings where there's still a vast majority of people there who are low income, because we're helping them. We've helped a couple of the buildings already get new boilers, new windows. We're reaching out to more of them, but I'd like to ideally have the capacity to try to get them to learn more about the model.
And in all of those buildings, the city played a role. They might have gotten $10,000 worth of basic repairs. It's not like they got it for nothing.
Yeah.
But they.
Yeah, it's a shame. I mean, because people that sell an apartment for $300,000 that they paid $250 for, and it seems like if they're allowed to do that, government should be able to recapture more of that their profit. I mean, they stop monitoring after a while.
We have a new person. I just wanted to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself, and you missed it. But when we started, everyone introduced themselves, and I got to self-identify when they got involved and why with Cooper Square, and if it was because of your housing, please do tell that story.
Well, I moved on to 4th Street.
What's your name?
My name is Sharon Goldstein. I've been living here for about 35, 36 years. I moved here when and was introduced to Cooper Square immediately, and brought into the warmth of the community. I was a single parent, living on public assistance at the time, and waiting for my daughter to be old enough to get into daycare center. And the buildings were a nightmare back then. They were owned by HPD, which everybody has told you about, and just very quickly my daughter's first winter was spent with weeks without heat and hot water. And it was through the efforts of the Cooper Square Committee that we were able to wrestle the buildings away from the city and accomplish what we've accomplished right now. I started as a staff person in Cooper Square as the receptionist and was on staff for 16 years. The 80s, in fact, I was just thinking about the period of time when I was involved with Cooper Square particularly was a very contentious time. The real estate interests were trying to wrestle the buildings away. We had fabulous political support, and then we had those people who were trying to undermine all that we were trying to accomplish. And there was this one, I will mention his name once and that's it, Antonio Pagan,
He's been mentioned.
who just did whatever he could to undermine the organization. At one point, the executive director and I think and Steve was doing fundraising, and they went on unemployment, and the rest of the staff. We took a 10-hour cut in our time so that one of the last person hired would not be fired because she was a single mother with 3 children, and. Antonio Pagan had his backing by all the real estate offices around the city, and it was just clear they did not want to see this accomplished. But with the struggle and meetings with the tenants, I mean, the organizing that Cooper Square did historically within the community here, in terms of accomplishing the community, the Mutual Housing Association, and then the Land Trust, was really critical to allowing people to stay housed. And I mean, I don't know where I would have been, or so many of the people I know would be, if it wasn't for the fact that the MHA was accomplished and protected by the Community Land Trust. And Marty Berger, bless his heart, was just, we didn't do anything without sending it to Marty for him to look it over and make sure that there was nothing that anyone could fault us on. And he was just, I always thought of him as sort of one of the backbones. We had a number of backbones, but he was really a critically important person.
This brings us to a really important question, which is a follow-up to the last, about what can we pull forward, but what made this thing work? What held it together? What were the essential components? And if you could be even philosophical about it, that'd be wonderful.
I think that from the beginning, you know, I've been doing a lot of speaking about organizing because of Cooper Square. And I figured out 5 ways to make an organization work. And the first one is, if you don't have the people involved, you have nothing. I mean, you might have a great organizer, you might have a great speaker, you might have a great lawyer. If you don't have the troops on the ground who are involved, you might as well quit before you start. You have nothing. And from the beginning, the people who live in these buildings were told, you want to keep your apartment? You've got to come to meetings. You got to pay $1 a year dues. If we have to go to City Hall, you have to take a day off from work and go with us. If you don't protect your roof, your kids will not have a roof. And they stepped up to the plate. They learned. I mean, we made it clear to them. We might be smart, we might be organizers, we are nothing without you. You have to be the backbone of this organization. And they have been. They did take off from work. When we went to a hearing, everyone wore a yellow t-shirt with black writing that had the name of the thing we wanted to pass. Vote yes on whatever it was. And we said, and you don't come once and then you stay home. It's an ongoing struggle. So number one, we had the troops. They were educated to know that if they didn't do it, it would not happen. And they did it. They really understood that you want heat, you want hot water, you want a roof over your head, be involved or we're not going to win. So we had the troops. That's the first thing.
And what were the others?
What?
What are the other pieces?
Okay. The other pieces were, you have to have the technicians that do your bidding. By that I mean the planner, the lawyer, the accountant. You have to have people that do your bidding. I remember we had a demonstration when the city had offices on the corner of Stuyvesant Street and 3rd Avenue. Do you remember that building? The city moved in there. They moved in there. And they weren't doing what they had to do for the neighborhood. And there was a young lawyer who was very ambitious, and he wanted to become a legislator. And he volunteered to be our lawyer for that demonstration. And what we did was, we took a key and we put epoxy on it, and we put it in the door of the place, which was closed, it was a Sunday, and broke off the key. And then then we had a big picket line and say, the city office is not responding to our needs, and we picketed with this young lawyer be out, he was there. And then the people came to work and they couldn't get in. And they tried their keys and they couldn't get in. So we demonstrated and yelled and screamed, and the lawyer came to us and said, I can get you all off. You just have to plead guilty and we said, what are you talking about, guilty? We're not guilty. We're fighting for our lives. What do you mean guilty? We're not guilty, and we're not pleading guilty. We're innocent. The city is guilty. Are you representing us? I'm representing you. All right. If you won't say that we're not guilty, we'll get another lawyer. He said, no, I like your group. I want to be your lawyer. All right, we're not guilty. We're fighting for our rights. We're fighting for our apartments. We didn't do anything wrong. If they can't get in, that's not our problem. So he pleaded for our case and we got off. We were freed. The point is that the lawyers didn't do what they wanted to do. We made it clear to them from the beginning, made it clear to Walter Thabit, you're not doing, because the reason planners make money is they either work for corporations or the city. He worked only for the community. That's why he never had any money, because he worked only for the community. And he was the best advocate planner in the country. He was really great. And we made sure that our lawyer did what we wanted, like Marty Berger, not what they wanted. So first you have to have the troops on the site, that's one. Two, you have to have professionals who do your bidding, not what they were trained in law school to do, but what you want them to do. And we had that, The third thing is that you have to learn how to manipulate the media. If the city isn't embarrassed by the crappy work they're doing, they're not going to change. But if the newspapers print things because we have a good demonstration, and they're embarrassed, then they move. You have to learn how to manipulate the media. And boy, we were masters at that. We had demonstrations that were so creative. I remember Walter once said, put out a press release and tell them they weren't building the housing. We're waiting, we've got the plan, nothing is happening. Put out a press release that says we're going to build a building in 10 minutes. So all the media came. And whenever the media came, we always had big picnic jugs filled with something that was loaded with booze. Because the media are big news hounds. They really were drinkers. So if in the winter we'd have hot chocolate that was half rum. We'd have cold drinks that were filled with gin. And we'd give them glasses full, and they would. And another thing, whenever they reported a story well, we wrote a letter, not to the reporter, but to the manager of the newspaper or the television station, and said, your reporter did such an honest, careful, professional job. We want to congratulate you for having such dedicated, professional staff. And that would be very beneficial to we learned how to deal with the media. And there was a building on the corner of 1st Street and 2nd Avenue. It's called the Q Building. And the city was selling it to developers for $1. They wanted developers to come and look in the building. The building was a disaster, a huge building. It's still there. It's our building. That's where Jasmine lives. We wanted that building. We wanted to build it into a building for poor people. And we wanted to make it a co-op. And so we went to the site, and the developers would come, and we would ride with them, and we'd say, watch out, you can fall through the elevator in a minute. You know, we rode with them, or we wouldn't let them get into the building. And they wanted to sell it to the developers for $1. And we fought like tigers, and we got that building, and we had to pay $11,000 to get that building. But we got it, and we turned it into a building for what?
It was the first co-op for formerly homeless.
Yes, it's the first co-op. It was a
families,
co-op
yeah.
for formerly homeless
Homeless
people. They were black, they were Hispanic, they were Chinese, they were deaf, they were blind. That building was filled with the most incredible people, and we got incredible publicity. We learned how to manipulate the media so that we'd get good stories for us. So we had the troops, we had professionals who did our building, we learned to manipulate the media, and we had a very active board of directors.
You were here in the 60s, and your husband was one of the organizers. Do you remember any lessons from that period that we should not forget around the organizing efforts?
Really,
I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
you put me on the spot. No, I really can't think of anything right now. I'll have to think about it. I'll let you know.
Come back.
Come back.
Just interrupt if you think of something.
There's three things that Francis mentioned. There is a fourth thing, which is a vision. And Francis has always had that vision. That's why we're successful.
So what is that? What vision?
The vision is housing for people, not for profit.
Wasn't there a saying?
Yeah, but
wasn't there a saying like that?
Met Council.
Yeah. What was the saying?
Housing for people, not for profit.
Okay, I thought it was
Right.
good. Okay.
Well, I think one of the things that we had visionaries who were in leadership.
Right.
Valerio had, he really shepherded us. Esther Rand, but those are before me, but in terms of my experience, which was mostly in the 80s and the 90s, is one of the things that I think was most expressive of Cooper Square was its sensitivity to the diversity of the community. And nothing went out that wasn't translated to English, Spanish, and Chinese. And that was, I think, that what brought a lot of people in, because these were especially the Asian community, was not a community that really engaged. But because of the sensitivity, and each building was organized. I don't know if you spoke about this before, but every building had a tenants, tenants were organized in each building, and we had hundreds and hundreds of meetings with the tenants to talk about the vision that we all shared and that we wanted and what we needed to do. So we were constantly meeting with the tenants, and then we would have community-wide meetings, and we would vote on, there was an alternate plan that was introduced, and we wanted everybody to be on board. And so we would have meetings with the tenants, and we'd get input from the tenants in the building meetings and then in these large community meetings. And to me, that was an extraordinary approach to social justice and just recognition of the diversity and the wonderful quality of the organization.
We also celebrated every tiny victory. No matter if we had a victory of any kind, a little one or a big one, we would have a party, we would have music, we would have food up the wazoo, people, and we didn't have to, everybody brought it. We didn't go out and buy food. Everybody made food, and we'd have fabulous food, rice and beans and pernil and wonderful food. And we would dance, and we would have music, and we would celebrate. We would celebrate every single victory, because for some people that was their nightlife. They didn't have a lot of money. They never went out, they rarely went out to eat. And every big meeting we have, always there's a lot of food.
Steve, lessons.
Well, I think.
What must we not forget this time around?
Well, I mean, I guess since I came at a somewhat later period for Cooper Square, I've worked on trying to expand the organization's work, because so much of our work was in the urban renewal area, you know, up until like the mid-90s, because it had to be. It had to, you know, there was other outreach beyond that, but I've sort of had the luxury of being able, since the victory was kind of won by the mid-90s with getting the city to sell the buildings to the MHA, I started doing more outreach to, you know, organizing of tenants in rent-stabilized apartments, because gentrification was intensifying and more tenants were coming into our office facing displacement pressure. Long-term tenants with, you know, below-market rents were just really being harassed. So I've been able to bring on a couple of staff people who are doing more organizing in those kind of buildings. And we've actually worked to try to build multi-building coalitions of tenants living in buildings owned by Steve Croman or by Ben Shaul, or you know, some of the Westbrook Partners, Extel, different people who bought up like clusters of buildings, and the tenants were all starting to get, you know, these harassing notices, or, you know, being approached and they asked if they want to take a buyout. So I felt like, you know, it's important for Cooper Square to have the people around us to know the kind of work that we've done, so that, you know, they don't just look at, oh, that's that group of people on 3rd and 4th Street, you know, the low-income people. That I wanted them to see that Cooper Square is also really working with people who are not necessarily as low income, but still struggling and rent poor. So we've been able to do that, you know, and fortunately we've been able to get more staffing in the last couple of years, and I've got a really good organizer who's been doing Brandon's doing a really good job of developing a campaign around Department of Buildings, because they just look the other way when landlords are just ripping apart apartments and people's ceilings are collapsing and they're getting watered down. I mean, it's things that MHA tenants had to deal with too, I'm sure, when the city owned the buildings, but this is very deliberate by some of these landlords to just try to drive people out of their homes. So he's organizing tenants and trying to do a whole campaign and broaden it with other groups around the city to go after Department of Buildings. So
what does that remind you about? Like, what's the lesson we can distill out of that?
Well, I mean, just that, you know, Cooper Square was always about organizing, and it was, you know, more militant in its earlier years. And I think we went through a period where we started doing more and more like social work kind of stuff, because we had people who had, you know, needs for certain types of entitlements. But I think we went through, because there was all that organizing and people kind of needed to take a little break from it. I think also more people's energies started focusing on running the MHA buildings, because they were in charge now, they were making the decisions. But there wasn't as much organizing because they didn't desperately need to do the organizing. They needed to go to meetings and plan, but they weren't out there like on the streets. So we've been trying to get tenants who are in rent stabilized apartments to understand they have to lead this fight. They have to fight, because rent stabilization could end up going away. I mean, it's not going to happen under Cuomo, but he could still end up allowing it to get weakened. I mean, we can't take for granted, because the Democrats in office, the tenants are going to get a much better deal. So it's an opportunity for tenants now, with the rent laws expiring next year again, to really push for stronger protections, because they got weakened so many times in the 90s and again under Pataki in the 2000s. So that's what we're trying to focus on, is really build and work in coalition with other groups around the city. So I've taken some of the lessons I've learned from Cooper Square and tried to apply it to what we're doing, you know, with that work.
We're turning to that,
Yeah.
the base work.
Trying to organize it.
Right. I mean,
And trying to build our base.
yeah.
You know.
One of the things that was always important was working in coalitions. So we worked with city-wide housing organizations from the get-go, and that's where we also, because we would get turnout and we would get, you know, we would support each other in our struggles.
I've been thinking recently that reports, even though they can be boring, can play a major role in this work. I know that reports, I know that in East Harlem, there's been a few reports about challenges around affordability and also around like PTH's vacancy count
Yeah.
that play a major role in bringing groups to the table and
Mhm.
being able to see the problem well and then join a collective effort. It helps
Right.
people come to collective action, and I wanted to hear your take on that in the history of Cooper Square. What role have reports and those types of activities played in bringing the work forward?
I think it's been basic. I mean, I'm interested that Picture the Homeless did a report on vacant land many years ago. Met Council.
That's
and
right.
Did a tremendous report on vacant land in the city, and we did it with amateurs. We just went around and issued a very slick bulletin about vacant land. I think it was 20 years ago.
Yeah, at least.
Now it's being done again by Picture the Homeless,
And
which
it
is
wasn't
great.
only vacant land, it was warehouse departments.
Yes, right, that's another.
We had big red
I mean,
signs with,
right.
with white print that said warehouse departments, so people knew that there were warehouse departments in these
Yeah,
buildings.
and that's
But
even
like you said, we were
more so
amateurs.
today.
Yeah.
And I think that Picture the Homeless is doing something about that. We wouldn't have a shortage if the landlords were forced to rent all the apartments that are
Right.
being warehoused.
Right.
But when it comes to Cooper Square, I think Walter did 8 or 9 major studies, which are bound, and we have them all. There was a study on the people on the Bowery, just that. There was a study about health care in the area, which clinics and stuff served. This area was very bad for local health care. So we have those reports that, and they were sent to the city. They were better than what the city could do. So it was helpful to show the city that this is the problem, you should do something about it. But I think that it's essential that this hard investigative work be done and bound together to influence our legislators to do something about it.
Did it affect the on-the-ground work?
Yeah, well, for instance, the public housing infill, one of the reports that came out was that we were paying, the public housing, NYCHA was paying like $75 million a year or $75,000, I don't remember the exact amount. Million, right.
Yeah.
A year to police when we already had police, and we were like, they were double dipping. So taxpayers and the public housing tenants are taxpayers, many of them are working people, were already paying for police. Yet the NYCHA was paying them an additional $75 million to police public housing. So because we found out about this through reports, we were able to challenge that. And the new mayor de Blasio took that away from the city. So that's a good thing that these reports are made, because we wouldn't have known about it otherwise. The same thing held true for sanitation collection. I don't remember the amount, but it's a whole lot of money that NYCHA was paying sanitation department for things that we as taxpayers as a whole were already paying for. Because of this report, we found out about it, and we were able to again pressure the new administration to not pay that.
Yeah, I mean, the main rationale behind infill housing was supposedly to raise $50 million, like lease the land, make $50 million a year off of it, so that they could pay for fixing up all the other, NYCHA units. So when you point out the fact that,
It's being mismanaged.
yeah, that they have the money, it's just that they're being forced to spend it on other things.
Steve, you put together a really great report. I wonder if you could tell me about it, what you believe the role of reporting is currently in Cooper Square.
Oh, which report are you talking about?
I think you're putting together these reports on the Lower East Side on the status of housing conditions. It's like the annual report for Cooper Square, but you sort of frame. I don't know. Sorry to put you on the spot, but I think they're important.
No, I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not really working on any particular report right now.
This was from a few years ago. It's up there. Cooper Square Community Strategic Plan.
Oh, strategic plans,
For
I'm
the
sorry.
strategic
plan.
Yeah, we do them like every few years, yeah. I mean, it helps us just to bring everybody together, our board, our stakeholders, and figure out, you know, like where we're at and what we need to be focusing on over the next several years. So, you know, we decided to like try to do more greening work. So we started working and getting involved with the weatherization program and raising more money to try to do that kind of work. We wanted to try to still find more opportunities to create affordable housing, and there was the vacant building on 13th Street. And so I got a $3 million grant from the city to develop housing for homeless LGBT youth, which we're going to be hopefully breaking ground on in a few months. So
That's wonderful.
That building's a long time.
I know.
It's really scandalous. The public housing, they're doing this infill plan. They're not going to do it, but in order to raise money to fix the public housing, there's never been repairs done in buildings as well as they're done in Cooper Square. I mean, if you wait a week, you wait a long time to get anything done. Usually it's a couple of days. And our rents are tiny. They're really low. But you don't wait more than a day or two to get a repair done. And I remember I generally give the initial speech when a bunch of new tenants have moved in. And I made my speech, and there's a young, tall Chinese guy sitting next to his aged father who's now living in Cooper Square. And he gets up and he says, I don't understand. My father pays $59 a month. And whenever he has a repair needed, it's done in a couple of days. How can you afford it? How can you afford it? So we say, well, I'll tell you how we can afford it. I pay $1,000 for my apartment. Everybody thinks I'm very rich. I pay $1,000. The people above me and below me in the exact same apartment, they pay $5,000, and then the one below me pays $6,000. The difference between what I pay and they pay is profit. I said the reason that we're able to maintain the apartments well and make sure that your father has a decent apartment is because there is no profit. None. He said, you mean the rents that my father pays for everything? I said, everything. The rents that the tenants pay cover the staff, they cover the taxes, they cover, except we don't have taxes. We don't, for 40 years we don't pay taxes. Only because we have a community land trust. If we didn't have, we wouldn't have won that. So it's just amazing to people that the reason that public housing is not being well maintained is because the money is being wasted. The graft and the incompetence in public housing is why it's not being maintained. Because their rents are our rents are much lower than public housing. Mm-hmm. But we can make repairs in a couple of days. Mm-hmm. And they can't because they're wasting all that money.
And it's deliberate. It's deliberate.
The graft in public housing is outrageous.
You mentioned the plan. You mentioned the early action plan. When you first
the alternate plan.
The alternate plan.
Well, that was.
You didn't mention the 80-minute alternate.
It was an alternate plan that came up. That was before my time, actually. The alternate plan.
But it was still powerful and
But
being used when you arrived.
Well,
Yes.
it was the way we organized, and it was really a plan of what we wanted to accomplish. We wanted to have community centers. We wanted to have, I'm not even sure right now what the alternate plan was.
But it's kind of staged.
Yeah, it was just a staged development, which is what
No one would be
right.
one would
Oh,
be
that's
moved,
what it was.
no one
right.
would be moved out.
Right.
No.
They would sort of checkerboard people, which is essentially what they ended up doing, so that you were housed, you weren't displaced at any time, and that was what the alternate plan they were. We were hoping to get low-income housing and middle-income housing, but that was never accomplished because I think it was it the governor who at some point said there would be no middle-income housing built south of 98th Street. And so that sort of turned everything around. And so then we ended up having to do the deal, the new plan, which it actually ended up greater than anywhere else, where we ended up with 60-40, because if you included the MHA buildings, the 13 buildings, plus the Cube building, plus the low-income housing that went into the new construction, it came out that we had 60% that was low income, and then the rest was market rate. But we were able to get a community center. They had taken down the Quando building. Was that the Quando building?
That came later.
What? That was, which was the building on was on Houston Street? Which was that?
Well, Quando was.
And we said that when they took down the building, that was
Church
the
of All
second
Nations
time.
became
Yeah, that was the Church of All Nations.
Yeah.
So I'm mixing things up. Because I really
It's a
wasn't the
long
person
history.
now. It's a very long history. It's a very long history.
I've got most of it notes.
Yeah, I'm sure I
On those
don't know
story
what you talked about before I came in.
I know that we've talked for a while, and I myself am going to get tired, and some of you are a lot older than me. So I wanted to ask one, sort of, about to wrap up, to give you guys the rest of your day, and I wanted to ask if you could do something with me. Because there's these different periods in Cooper Square's history, and one of the things that we're going to do to try to share it is to present it in pockets, in sort of like sections of history. And I wanted to see, I don't know if it helps to look up there, it might help to look, but if any of you can identify like a section of the story that can be told together, that you think, is sort of like, this piece isn't important. Like maybe, Fran, I think that you probably identify the beginning, like the alternate plan, the creation of the alternate plan is the beginning of Cooper Square, being like the formation and the community plan.
The 100 meetings the first year.
So I was wondering if each person, for the section that they were most active, look there and think of what you would title that section and what would be the story there. Just take a minute to think about it, and then I just want to get it down so we have that option. Does that make sense?
Not in my head.
For the section that you were involved, what would you call that section?
The Age of Enlightenment. Thank you, Cooper Square.
And which section was that you?
Well, it's ever since I came around Cooper Square and met council, it's totally changed my life, and for the better. I mean, I met my great wife here, 37 years of marriage. So.
Thank you for that. In terms of the question, though that's so beautiful, is how can we name as the collective history of these sections?
They were all periods of challenge of
Yes.
different kinds. I mean, I was here in the 80s. I started here in 83, 82, and I was here till 98. And it was just one challenge after the other. The meeting with HPD was, that was organizing the tenants. So, I mean, but they were all, essentially, they were all involved organizing and struggle and...
And so you were most active in the era when you were negotiating with the city.
We were negotiating with the city, right.
So that was
HPD.
the buildings had been transferred they had been bought up in the 70s by the city.
Right.
And then the
So
city
what-
owned them, and then you were negotiating to try to get them.
We were working with the city on making repairs because they were in such horrible condition. Just meeting with the city on a monthly basis to get the repairs taken care of. I remember I was in my building when a toilet from the 6th floor fell into the toilet in the 5th floor and then into the 4th floor. I mean, the buildings were just crumbling around us. So it was, while we were struggling to to create the MHA and to get all that accomplished, it was trying to repair boilers, replace boilers, replace the pipes. I mean, Val has pipes in his office from back then where there was such corrosion in the pipe that you could if you held it up to light, you would see a pinhole, and that's what people were living with. Their water was coming through. So the conditions were really horrible, and it was forcing the city because of using, embarrassing them, showing up at HPD with tenants and pieces of pipe, and just really calling them out on the conditions that the people were living in.
So what would you call that? You can even be literal if you want, or it can be
I don't know.
Under city ownership, right? What is that?
It was transition from city ownership to tenant control.
I remember one crucial time was when we spent 8 months when they took away our vacant land. The city took away the whole plan depended on staging.
Mm-hmm.
And when they took away that vacant land, because they wanted to, we went to the city council for 9 months, every month, to demand it back.
Mm-hmm.
And then Mary Perot Nichols, and we had a state assemblyman, his name was Louis DeSalvia, and he owned the liquor store on the corner of the Bowery and Houston Street. And he supported the Cooper Square plan. But he got a letter from Robert Moses, and the letter said, if you will support my plan, I will give you the vacant lot on Houston Street, and you're a member of the San Gennaro Association, and you can build middle-income housing, and you will make millions of dollars. So Louis DeSalvia, who had supported our plan, came out in support of Robert Moses.
What year was that? That's in the 60s then.
That
Or the
was in
60s.
the 60s.
Yeah.
So we went to City Hall, to the Board of Estimate, every month to get back our land, because without that land, we would not have the plan.
Mm-hmm.
And every month we were turned down. And 1 month we went and we decided, this is it, we're not coming back. We're gonna sit there until we get that land back. That's the vacant lot on Houston Street, that's crucial. That means there's no relocation.
Mm-hmm.
So I spoke, and a lot of people spoke. I spoke, and Donald Elliott was chairing the meeting. And he said, thank you, Ms. Golden, sit down. And I said, no, I'm not sitting down. You give us back the land and I'll sit down. And he said, I heard what you had to say. We'll take your thoughts into consideration. You have to leave. And I said, I'm not leaving. I'll leave when we get the land back. So they said, Ms. Golden, we will have you arrested if you don't leave. I said, what you'll do, I am not leaving till we get the land back. Now I'm holding the mic. The mic is on the podium. There's a podium. And the mic goes through a hole into some plug. That's the microphone. I'm holding the microphone. And 2 cops come and grab my shoulders and pull me away. Because they pull me away, the thing gets pulled and the podium falls down. So I'm Clemencia Robledo gets a hold of me and I get put into the paddy wagon. And before I could turn around, Ernesto Martinez is at the podium and he's saying, we want our land back. Mm-hmm. And they said, Mr. Martinez, we've been through this. You have to sit down. And he said, no, I'll sit down when you give us back our land. Mm-hmm. And my daughter and 7 other young people the troopers come to arrest Ernesto. And they grab a hold of him, and the troopers are pulling him one way, and Rini and the gang are pulling him the other way. And so Donald Elliott says, arrest them all. So 8 of these young women and Ernesto get arrested, and they get taken away. That picture in my house is of Rini being arrested. So the next month we got our land back. But this was, 9 people got arrested that day.
Moses.
And so then what happened, the story is so unbelievable. Now we're gone, right? We're all arrested. And Donald Elliott is sweating, and he says, Mamie Jackson from Bronx, you're next. And this woman who didn't know us from a hole in the wall, but sat through this whole thing, gets up and says, I yield to Cooper Square. And he said, oh, Jesus. Bill Johnson from the Bronx, you're next. And Bill Johnson gets up and says, I yield to Cooper. They saw what was going on. Their neighborhood was being destroyed by the city as well. He says, I yield to Cooper Square. And he says, this meeting is adjourned. No one else will be called. Go home. That was the best arrest I ever had. That was the most exciting arrest. It's like a short story, how these people that didn't even know us could see what was happening and how they were getting screwed, and they yielded. We never talked to them. They did it out of their own, I yield to Cooper Square.
Yeah. Well, Moses parted the Red Sea. Moses was trying to, what Moses went about doing was trying to part all the communities.
Of
He
course.
did up in the Bronx,
Right.
he was doing that in the...
That was the best
that's
arrest
great.
I ever had.
Steve, what would you call your section? I called your section "Give Us Back Our Land."
Okay.
Does that sound okay for that section?
That's perfect, yes.
And then Steve, what's this section that you come into called?
Well, it's partly, supporting the MHA and their work, but also trying to finish up there was still unfinished business with the cultural buildings. In 2000, I pulled together a meeting of all the cultural groups on the block, and they ended up forming Fourth Arts Block. And once they got started and started holding meetings, there was already a group of really bright, creative people coming together who had ideas about, what to do to preserve the cultural buildings on the block. And they had learned something about the MHA and what they, Cooper Square had gone through. But they basically, they wanted ownership of their buildings so that they could just preserve them long-term as cultural spaces. And they wanted the city to put in the money because they had spent decades basically doing sweat equity to keep their buildings together with very little help from the city.
He won that. He was
Yeah,
very important in that victory.
So that, I can take some credit in getting it all started and convening meetings, but there was a lot of really bright people, like I said, who really took it from there. And one of the members, Ryan Gillum, who's with Downtown Art, a few years later, like in 2005, she wrote a grant to, I think it was Deutsche Bank and maybe the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, but she got a big grant, like a 3-year grant to fund an executive director. So they brought Tamara Greenfield on, who's currently the director now. So she's been there about 8 years. And she's really done a great job of just sort of building that organization and reaching out to more cultural groups. And now FAB has basically got like 28 member groups, not just on this block, but they've reached out to PS 122. And
That's one block with that many groups.
But it's also Clemente Soto Velez over on Suffolk Street near Delancey. And so, I think they have a vision for really being sort of an association of cultural groups in the Lower East Side of East Village. And it's very diverse. There's the groups on the block include, like 3 Latino theaters that own their own theater spaces. There's Duo Theater and Teatro Yati and Teatro Circolo. And there's Alpha Omega Dance Company and Downtown Art have a building together. New York Theater Workshop was able to got money from the city to build a set design studio. La Mama owns their 2 buildings on the block. Rod Rogers Dance Company owns with Duo. So really glad to see the way they just pulled it all together, and the buildings are almost all completed in terms of the renovation. There's still, some of them have more to do, but a lot of it's been done.
Wow.
So there was that, and also I did some work. I brought one of the buildings, 8090 3rd Street. I brought it into the MHA program because I think it was 1998 or 99 when Lucille Carrasquero, one of the residents she lived in a city-owned building that wasn't in the urban renewal area, and she came to us and said, she came to us and said that the city is trying to put her building in the TIL program, and she didn't want to go into that program because the city had tried to put them in TIL like 10 years before, and people were fighting amongst themselves. There was a faction of people who wanted to go in TIL, and they were, trying to get everyone else to go along, and they just were while they were in TIL, I guess they were managing the building themselves and getting trained. But these people were taking over and controlling things and doing corrupt things like bringing friends of theirs into the building and to get apartments. And anyway, it didn't work, and the city took it back into central management for a while. But then they tried to put it in TIL again. So she came to us, and so I went and reached out, door knocked in the building, introduced her to Val, and he explained the MHA model to them, and they said that's what we want. So she led the tenants in her building to get involved, and she's a longtime activist herself. She was involved in the labor movement.
She's wonderful.
So this is sort of maybe like new. What would you?
It was like expanding the MHA
Expanding
model
the MHA.
To bring in another building.
Like he did in his building on
And
21st
we worked.
Street.
I worked with Val also. Reached out to Tito's building.
Hi.
So that was about 1999 or so, and the city finally relented, and it was kind of there was a legal battle involved, but so there was a little bit of a legal fight involved. The tenants, there was a faction of about 4 tenants who were against what Lucille was trying to do. And 2 of them didn't even live in the building. One of them lived in Baltimore, but her mother lived in the apartment, and she tried to take over the leadership of fighting against going into the MHA because she wanted, obviously, to be able to buy it and flip it. Anyway, they weren't successful, but they did try to slow things down. They brought this guy, Maine Miller, in, who was a lawyer who has fought against the MHA on a few different occasions, but he's always lost. But anyway, so we were successful eventually in getting it into the MHA program, and it got fully renovated. And
Also 21st Street.
yeah.
And 21st. So those are those new buildings expanding the MHA.
Right, but
The
they're
work
part
it
of the
does.
MHA.
What? I'm something I'm curious about. What is the thought about the MHA playing administrative roles in buildings it doesn't own? What is the value of that?
The value is it keeps us honest. It keeps the tenants association from fighting among each other because it provides leadership, and it really takes care of its buildings and they're managing because they do provide services. They don't leave us without heat in the winter. If the boiler breaks, they take care of it right away, and they advocate on our behalf all the time, even though they're just managers.
Part of the community land trust is to expand this plan to others. And that's why we've adopted other buildings. And I think that it's really important that we grow by including other buildings that are in trouble. And if they can buy the community land trust model, we'll be better off. So we try to expand, and that's why we took on that one in 3rd Street.
Why wouldn't your building go into the land trust?
There is a phase that Cooper Square was very involved in that I'd like to mention, if that's okay.
Yeah.
At one point, there were many squatters moving into empty, rundown buildings in the neighborhood, mostly city-owned buildings because the landlords had abandoned them because they wouldn't pay their taxes. However, a lot of these buildings were already earmarked by non-for-profit housing organization to build affordable housing there. So basically what the squatters was doing were taking buildings that we already had targeted and already was spoken for low-income housing, and they were taking those buildings over. And we were not opposed to squatters. We were opposed to that they would come in as outsiders and take what we've been fighting for so long to keep and to build affordable housing. So we decided to build a campaign that we too believe in squatting. However, our focus is not to take away buildings that are pinpointed for affordable low-income housing. So we targeted a warehouse building, a privately owned warehouse building with something like 20 apartments, totally empty, across the street from Johnson Square Park. And we went in there, some of us went in there, and we planned to have gotten arrested. And we did. The cops came in with riot gear. They took us out. I was one of them. A pregnant woman was another. A few of us were there. They pulled us out, and they put us in a paddy wagon. Well, there was a priest over at St. Bridget's who always fought for homeless people. He decided that this was wrong. So he sat in front of the paddy wagon. And after he sat in front of the paddy wagon, like 50 people, 100 people sat in front of the paddy wagon. Of course, they were all arrested. But it changed the mindset that squatting is romantic, you know, it's this great heroic thing. No, it's not if you're doing it to buildings that are targeted, that have already got funding for low-income housing. Basically, you're taking away housing from the community. So it changed the whole focus of squatting, that squatting just for squatting is not necessarily good for the community. They're squatting for good purposes, and they're squatting for selfish purposes. So that was a campaign that Cooper Square was a major part of.
When was that?
When was it, in the 90s or the 80s? You remember, Fran, you were one of the people who got arrested.
Shot.
I think it was the 90s.
That was in
Early
Probably
90s.
the early 90s.
Early 90s.
Yeah, I mean, I know there was a lot of discussion still around squat, because I think that there was an agreement that was finally reached between the squatters and the city with the help of UHAB. Wasn't UHAB involved?
Yeah.
Where they finally came to an agreement about a plan to get the building. Because the squatters, a lot of them were anarchists, and they didn't really want to work with the city at all. They didn't want to sign any kind of documents about, or give their names, or give personal information, social security number, all this stuff the city is going to require if it's going to put a building into an official program. And finally they relented and agreed to do that, and the city in turn agreed to spend millions of dollars renovating some of these old buildings.
So all these revolutionary anarchists all sold their buildings and made a big profit out of it.
Great. I think we should stop. We've done a lot and just chill. Thank you all so much.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
for your
Josh.
hard
You guys
work.
very much.
We appreciate it.
And you're the hardest working.
Your arm must be exhausted.
Exhausted.